Hello students, this is the first part of my lecture on chapter 12, which is the Keynesian perspective. Now, this perspective, of course, is named after the British macroeconomist John Maynard Keynes, right? And he sort of reinvented macroeconomics during the Great Depression, right? So what we're going to cover in this chapter, and again, my lecture is broken up into two parts, part one and part two. And the entire chapter will essentially cover the following topics. We will first briefly review aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And this is something you are familiar with because I directed you to a certain YouTube lecture, if you recall. Right, but I'll quickly review this. The second thing that I will talk about is the building blocks of the Keynesian model. Right. The third thing that I will talk about is the expenditure multiplier. Now this I'm going to deal with in more detail, much more detail than your book. So my lecture will be quite important in this respect because I'll be covering much more than your book chapter does. Right? And finally, the Phillips curve. So this is what I'm going to cover in chapter 12. So these two, I suppose, will be part one of my lecture, and these two topics will be part two. Right, so let's quickly review the ADAS model. Right, so AD, of course, stands for aggregate demand, and AS stands for aggregate supply. So to put it briefly, we view the entire economy as if it were a market. Now, you're familiar with the traditional diagram for a competitive market, correct? It's basically a diagram like this. You have a quantity axis, you have a price axis, you have a demand curve that is negatively sloped because of the law of demand, and you have a supply curve that is positively sloped because of the law of supply, correct? So this is your quantity axis, that's the price axis, the market demand curve, market supply curve, and we have equilibrium in this market where the two curves intersect, so that gives us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So we're familiar with this, but what we're going to do now is use this framework for the entire economy. So we're going to view the entire economy as if it were a single market, right? So in order to do that, of course, we're going to change some terminology, correct? Our demand curve is going to be called the aggregate demand curve, right? Why aggregate? Because this is demand for all final goods and services, right? Not just the market, not just milk or beef, right? So for instance, this here could be the quantity of milk, and this could be the price of milk, in which case this is the milk market, correct? But we are going to view the entire economy as a market, right? So what we are going to measure along the horizontal axis is the quantity of all final goods and services, right? And what is our measure of that? What is our measure of the quantity of all final goods and services? Well, we have a ready-made quantity already that we are familiar with. It's called real GDP. And the symbol for that, of course, is Y. We've used the letter Y to represent real GDP. So real GDP on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we're going to measure all prices, and all prices are represented by this concept of the price level. P. So what is this price level? Now the easiest way to think about this is think of this as the GDP deflator or the GDP price index, right? The GDP price index. And I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to scale it down by 100. So it's going to be the GDP price index divided by 100. So that, right? So that's our measure of all prices. Now, in this diagram, I'm going to draw a demand curve and a supply curve, right? So the demand curve is like this, and the supply curve, at least in the short run, is positively sloped. Now, strictly speaking, it isn't a straight line. The supply curve is typically drawn as a curve, and what sort of curve is it? And this is something that you will discover if you read the relevant book chapter. It's typically drawn as a curve like this, flat in the beginning and then steeper and steeper until it becomes almost vertical. So that is a typical way of drawing the aggregate supply curve, but for simplicity, I'm going to draw the curve as a straight line. Right? So this is our aggregate demand, A for aggregate. And what is the meaning of the term aggregate? Aggregate means total, right? So this is aggregate demand, meaning demand for all goods, all final goods and services. And here we have the aggregate supply curve, and we have equilibrium where the two curves intersect. And what kind of equilibrium is that? We call that macroeconomic equilibrium. So we have macroeconomic equilibrium where the two curves intersect. This gives us the equilibrium price level P star, and down here on the horizontal axis we get the equilibrium level of real GDP. Right? Now in this horizontal axis we could also mark off full employment real GDP. Right? What is full employment real GDP? Well, that's the level of GDP that would be produced at full employment. Now, you know what the meaning of full employment is from our chapter on unemployment, right? So when do we have full employment in the economy? When the unemployment rate is as low as it can be, which is a natural rate of unemployment, about 4% in the US, right? So this is the level of GDP that would be produced when everyone in the workforce, everyone in the labor force is working. Of course, when I say everybody, I am leaving out the naturally unemployed, the frictionally and the structurally unemployed, because they will always be there, right? So in this diagram that I've drawn here, equilibrium GDP at present is less than full employment GDP. Now it takes workers to produce GDP, correct? So currently then at equilibrium GDP Y star, employment must be less than at full employment, right? Because Y star is a lower level of GDP than Y sub F, right? So lower employment currently. Lower employment, of course, means higher unemployment. So you might say that currently the unemployment rate is greater than the natural rate of unemployment, greater than 4%. So the unemployment rate at present might be, for instance, 8%, right? In which case there is 4% cyclical unemployment. How do I get the 4%? The 8% minus the natural rate of 4%. Correct? So in addition to the naturally unemployed, we currently at equilibrium GDP Y star, we currently have cyclically unemployed workers as well. Right? So this is what a recession is about, correct? So this gap here, this gap between Y star and YF has a name. It's called a recessionary gap. So this is how we would portray an economy in recession. Right? So this is our simple ADAS model. Right? Now in the YouTube lecture that I asked you to listen to, my old YouTube lecture on the ADAS model, you learned of the various factors that cause the AD curve to shift and also the AS curve to shift, correct? So let me quickly review those factors. Right, so let's start with factors that cause a change in AD. Factors causing a change in aggregate demand. Now, aggregate demand is made up of 4 spendings, and they are C, consumption spending, I, investment spending, mainly the purchase of new machineries by businesses, but also increases in firm stocks of inventories, as we learned, right? And then we have G, government spending, right? And then X minus M, and that's what the rest of the world buys from the United States in net, right? So these are the 4 components of AD. So what would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift? So let me first draw a diagram of, let's say, increasing AD, right? So this is real GDP. That's the price level. This is the AD curve. At this particular value of the price level, the 4 shoppers, households, firms, government, and the rest of the world, purchase or demand the following quantity of real GDP, Y1. So what would be a rightward shift of the AD curve? Right? A rightward shift of the AD curve would be like this. The price level remains unchanged at P1, correct? But the 4 shoppers decide to buy more real GDP than before, Y1 prime. So this point now is the new quantity demanded, comma, price combination. Now that blue dot, of course, doesn't lie out there in space. It lies on a whole new AD curve. Correct? So this is what's meant by an increase in aggregate demand, a rightward shift. Same price level, and yet the 4 shoppers buy more. Right? So what might cause something like this to happen? Right? So let's look at C, I, G, and X minus M separately. Right? Again, I'm going over old ground here. You are familiar with this if you have listened to the YouTube lecture on AD and AS, correct? But let's quickly review this. So what are the factors that cause a change in consumption spending? Let's look at these separately. So let's start with consumption spending. And the factors in consumption spending are basically the disposable income of households. What's meant by disposable income? That would be income minus taxes, right? So disposable income would be income minus taxes. So this, of course, means that if the government were to lower taxes, that would leave households with more disposable income with which to go shopping. And that would then raise household consumption spending at the same price level as before, causing the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Right? So current disposable income. The next factor is expected future income. So if households expect that their income in the future is going to be higher, well, that might cause them to start to spend a greater share of their current income on consumption. Right? So for instance, if you learned that you were going to get a pay raise next month, you might already, with your current unchanged paycheck, you may already currently begin to spend more on consumption. Right? Expected future income. So this has to do with consumer optimism. So when consumers become optimistic about the future, that causes them to increase their consumption spending today, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. Right? And the third factor is changes in wealth. Right? Now, the commonest form of wealth holding in the US is real estate. Right? That's the commonest form of wealth holding in the US. So let's say there was a real estate boom and home prices went up, as they did before 2008, as you know, right? The Great Recession of 2008 was caused by plunging home values, you may know. So let's say that real estate prices skyrocket. So this means that if I own my own home, and let's say the value of the home used to be $100,000, but now it's $300,000, right, because of skyrocketing real estate prices. How will that make me think? I will now think that I am sitting on wealth worth $300,000. That may make me perhaps want to save a little less of my current paycheck. Right? Let's say my plans are that I will at some point retire, and now I could sell my home, take that money, and retire someplace. Right? So with rise in the value of my home, I may now think, well, there's no need to save quite as much as before for my retirement. In other words, I save less of my current paycheck, implying that I spend more on consumption. Right? So a rise in wealth leads to an increase in consumption spending. It induces the consumer to save less of his current paycheck, spend more. Right? So that's C. Now what about I? Investment spending. Now this depends upon, for instance, expected future profit. If firms expect high future profits, they may want to go out there and buy new machines. So this has to do with business optimism. Business optimism, right? Other factors might be, for instance, business taxes. Businesses pay taxes as well. So if these taxes were, for instance, to go down, that would leave businesses with more of their current sales revenues with which to go shopping for new machinery, right? And I am going to add something here now to even our discussion of consumption, and that is credit. I omitted mentioning that when I was discussing factors that cause a change in household consumption spending. But if credit became cheaper, meaning if the rate of interest fell, for instance, now wouldn't that cause household consumption spending to go up? How is that? Because a lot of household consumption spending, particularly on the big ticket items like cars, are financed by credit. The cheaper the credit, the lower the interest rate, in other words, the more likely it is for households to borrow money with which to go shopping. Right, so credit. And that will be a factor here as well for businesses, because businesses also go shopping for machinery on credit. So the cheaper the credit, the lower the interest rate, the more likely are firms to take out business loans from banks, etc., to go shopping for machinery. Right? So these are the factors that affect investment spending. Next, let's look at government spending. Now, government spending doesn't really depend on factors like the rate of interest, etc. Right? Government spending is part of the government's deliberate fiscal policy. Now, this is a term we encountered really early on in the course. Fiscal policy is the government's policy about government spending and taxes. So any change in government spending is going to be part of its deliberate fiscal policy. Right? Next, we come to net exports, X minus M. And here we have essentially two factors. One of them is economic conditions abroad. How's that? Let's say that the Mexican economy were to suffer a recession, making Mexicans poorer. So what will that do to Mexicans shopping here across the border? Right now, when Mexicans buy goods in America, that would be US exports, correct? So if Mexicans become poorer, they would buy less from the US, and that would cause exports to fall, meaning our net exports to fall. Right? So economic conditions abroad impact United States net exports. Right? The other factor here would be the relative price of US goods to foreign goods. Right? And this is impacted by the currency exchange rate. This is impacted by the currency exchange rate. Let me explain. If US goods became cheaper relative to foreign goods, what would that do to our exports? If US goods are becoming cheaper relative to, let's say, goods in Mexico, wouldn't that induce Mexicans to come across the border to buy our cheaper goods here? So exports would rise, correct? Meaning net exports would rise. What about imports? If US goods became cheaper relative to foreign goods, wouldn't Americans also buy more made in the USA and less imported goods? So when US goods become cheaper, that causes X to go up, M to go down. In other words, X minus M to go up. Right? Now, how does the currency exchange rate impact this? Right? In the following way. If we have a stronger dollar, for instance, what was a stronger dollar going to do? A stronger dollar is going to make, well, actually, maybe I should start with talking about in terms of a weaker dollar. Let me change that to a weaker dollar. So let's say that instead of $1 equaling 18 pesos, a dollar now starts equaling 25 pesos. Correct? So what would a weaker dollar do? A weaker dollar would do the following. It would make foreign goods more expensive for Americans, right? And US goods cheaper for foreigners. In other words, the relative price of US goods to foreign goods will have fallen. And that, of course, is going to cause our net exports to increase. Foreigners would buy more US goods because our goods are cheaper, and we would buy less of foreign goods because foreign goods are more expensive, causing X minus M to go up, right? X minus M. X goes up, X minus M goes up. M goes down, well, that also causes X minus M to go up. Correct? So a change in the currency exchange rate could also cause US net exports to increase. Specifically, a weaker dollar would do this, right? And that would cause the AD curve to shift to the right. Right, so this was a quick summary of factors that cause changes in AD. Let's now quickly review factors that cause changes in AS, okay? Again, this is stuff that you will have heard if you listen to the old YouTube lecture on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So let's start with factors that cause changes in aggregate supply. First, what would, for instance, a decrease in aggregate supply be about? Well, let me quickly draw an aggregate supply curve. Again, short-run aggregate supply drawn as a straight line instead of a curve for simplicity. Real GDP on the horizontal axis, price level on the vertical axis. The price level, of course, is a measure of all prices, right? So a good measure would be the GDP price index, as I mentioned. And this is the aggregate supply curve. So at this price level, P1, firms in the economy find it profitable to produce GDP Y1, right? But what if, for some reason, firms begin to find it profitable to produce a smaller amount of GDP than before? Y1 prime. At the same price level, that is. So we now have that red dot as the quantity supplied real GDP, comma, price level combination. That red dot, of course, doesn't lie in space. It lies on a whole new aggregate supply curve, one that is to the left of the original one. So this would be a decrease in aggregate supply. So what might cause a decrease in aggregate supply? And we have some prominent reasons. And this has to do with an increase in the firm's costs of production, for instance, right? So a rise in the prices of raw materials. This might do it with a higher price of raw materials. For example, energy. Energy is a universal raw material used by all industries. So a rise in, say, oil prices might cause firms to reduce their supply of real GDP. How is that? Because higher energy prices would eat away into firms' profits, would reduce firms' profits, making it less profitable to produce the old quantity of real GDP. Firms are going to cut back production, right? Because profits have decreased. Why have profits decreased? Because of a rise in the price of raw materials, such as energy, right? Another, of course, important raw material is labor. So a rise in the price of labor would do it too, and that, of course, is measured by the wage rate, the nominal wage rate, the actual dollar amount paid out in workers' paychecks, right? So the price of labor rose. Again, firms' profits would decrease, and therefore you might think of firms then producing less GDP than before. Correct? All right, so we've dealt with the factors that cause shifts in AD and AS. Yes? Right, quick test of our understanding of this material here. Let me give you a question. So let's say that the economy is currently in macroeconomic equilibrium as follows. So real GDP, the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate supply curve, the price level, and these are our P star and Y star. Right, now the question here is this. Let's say that the country's labor unions go on strike and successfully negotiate a hike in wages. So let's say that wages go up because of union action. How will that affect this diagram? Well, we've just learned that when the price of labor rises, well, workers become more expensive. Workers are a key input. This lowers firms' profits, right? And this basically makes it worthwhile for the firm to produce less than before at the same price level, right? So, in other words, the entire AS curve that you see here shifts to the left. We have a decrease in AS, correct? And what is going to be the impact of this on the equilibrium price level and equilibrium real GDP? Well, this is what we will get. The price level will now rise correct? So the price level will rise, and what about the equilibrium level of real GDP? Well, that's going to decrease. So a decrease in equilibrium GDP and a rise in the equilibrium price level, right? So this would be a case where the economy would produce less GDP than before. So what is the implication for unemployment? With the economy producing less GDP than before, of course, fewer workers will be employed, because after all, it's workers who produce GDP. Less GDP means less workers needed to produce it, right? So therefore, employment in the economy will fall, implying that unemployment will rise. So we have rising unemployment, and we have the price level going up. So we also have inflation. So this is a combination of unemployment, rising unemployment, and rising prices, meaning inflation. And these two together are called the phenomena of stagflation. Stag as in a stagnating economy, or an economy that isn't growing, for instance. Real GDP is decreasing instead of increasing. Stagnation of the economy, plus inflation, stagflation. Right. Now this kind of inflation, by the way, is called cost push inflation. Cost push inflation. This is inflation caused by a leftward shift of aggregate supply, a decrease in aggregate supply. Of course, the price level could also go up by a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Now, if there's inflation caused by an increase in demand, Well, that's called demand pull inflation. But here we have cost push inflation, right? But let me quickly write the other kind of inflation that we have, demand pull inflation. So this would be an increase in the equilibrium price level caused by a rightward shift of aggregate demand, like that, correct? And that too, of course, because the price level, the equilibrium price level to rise, meaning inflation to happen. But that kind of inflation is called demand pull inflation, right? Okay, so we've dealt with, pardon me, so we have reviewed the ADAS model. So we can put a check mark there. So the next thing we're going to look at is the building blocks of the Keynesian model. The building blocks of the Keynesian model. Now, the Keynesian model rests on the assumption that, the primary assumption that wages are inflexible, at least in the short run. Right? Wages are inflexible, and also that, and this is secondary really to our story, but that prices are inflexible also. And this is referred to as the assumption of sticky wages, inflexible as in sticky, and also sticky prices. Right, now, I'm going to explain this in two ways. And the first way that I will use is by looking at the labor market. So let me draw a diagram here for the labor market. So this is the quantity of labor, and here we have the wage, which is the price of labor, correct? Let me draw a demand curve for labor by firms and a supply curve of labor by workers. Right? Now let's say that we have a recession. Now what happened in a recession? In a recession, the four shoppers, households, firms, government, the rest of the world, essentially decrease their shopping. If they buy less from firms, firms in turn are going to have to demand fewer workers than before. Am I correct? Because after all, the demand for workers by firms is a derived demand. It depends on customer demand for the firm's products, right? So we are going to see the demand curve in this diagram shift leftwards like this. Correct? So let me mark out the original equilibrium. The original equilibrium is this. So this was L star, the original equilibrium employment, and this is Y star. Of course, at equilibrium, there is no unemployment, right? You have unemployment when there are more workers who wish to work than firms wish to hire. You have an excess supply of workers, in other words, that's unemployment. But in equilibrium, there is no excess supply, right? So there was no unemployment to begin with. Now, this is strictly speaking not true, because we've learned that even in the best of economic times, you always have some naturally unemployed workers, right? But this is abstracting from that. Now, if the wage was sticky, meaning if this equilibrium wage were not permitted to fall, then the following would happen with the shift leftward of the demand curve. The quantity demanded of labor would decrease to this. So this is the quantity demanded of labor. The quantity supplied of labor, on the other hand, remains at L star, right? And a gap emerges. So we now have an excess supply of labor, meaning unemployment. An unemployed worker is one who wishes to work but can't find a job. So that's the way sticky wages might explain the existence of cyclical unemployment. Right? And in an economic downturn, why does unemployment climb? Well, it climbs because of this. Now, if wages were flexible and the wage were allowed to fall to its new equilibrium value, you follow me? If the wage were allowed to fall to its new equilibrium value, which is here, then the labor market would once again be in equilibrium and there would be no unemployment. Remember, unemployment is an excess supply of labor. So to explain the excess supply of labor, the existence of it, we need inflexible wages. You follow me? Right? So this is where the Keynesian sticky wages assumption comes in. Right? This is how we might explain the rise of cyclical unemployment in an economic downturn. Correct? Now, there is another way, a deeper way to think about this, the significance of sticky wages. Now, remember that Keynesians believe that equilibrium GDP depends entirely on aggregate demand. Demand drives everything, in their view. Demand is king, right? In fact, they have this saying, it's called Keynes's law. Keynes's law, which is mentioned in one of your book chapters. Keynes's law, which says essentially that demand creates its own supply. So demand is all important. If demand increases, then the economy then produces more goods and services, meaning increases supply. And when the economy produces more goods and services, firms hire more workers, employment soars, unemployment decreases. Correct? So everything depends on demand, according to the Keynesians. Right? So let me draw a diagram here, the ADAS diagram now. So I'm going to draw an AD curve like this and an AS curve like this. Y, P, and we have equilibrium, macroeconomic equilibrium where the two curves intersect, P star and Y star. And let's say that we have a recessionary gap in that full employment real GDP is to the right of Y star. So we have a recessionary gap currently in current macroeconomic equilibrium. Therefore, the unemployment rate must be greater than the natural rate of unemployment. Correct? There must be cyclically unemployed workers in addition to the naturally unemployed. So this is going to mean high unemployment. Now, with high unemployment, wouldn't you think that all those desperate unemployed workers would gradually become willing to work for less and less wages? So wouldn't this drive down wages? That's expected, isn't it? When there is high unemployment and desperate workers, and as the desperation grows, workers become willing to work for less and less wages, or lower and lower wages. Now, if this were to happen, if wages were in fact to fall, we've just learned that the aggregate supply curve shifts when the wage changes, isn't it? Quickly remind you. Right, we've looked at this item here, for instance. Here we talked about the price of labor, the wage rising, and that causing a leftward shift in AS, correct? But if the opposite were to happen, if wages were to fall, then the aggregate supply curve would shift to the right. There would be an increase in aggregate supply, correct? With labor becoming cheaper, profits would rise, and the firms would find it worthwhile to produce more goods and services than before. shifting the aggregate supply curve to the right, correct? So coming back here, if this were to happen, we would expect the aggregate supply curve to start shifting to the right as the wage began to fall. And as this happens, guess what happens to equilibrium GDP? You can see that equilibrium GDP starts to increase. That's the new equilibrium there. And there. And at each step, we see that Y star is coming closer and closer to YF. The economy is moving towards full employment, if this were to happen. Correct? So in other words, if this were to happen, the recession would, in a sense, fix itself. Correct? But here is what puzzled Keynes, the original John Maynard Keynes. Remember, he was thinking up all this macroeconomics during the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression didn't just go away. Now, this story is true. If high unemployment causes wages to fall, well, that would cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right, as we've seen here, bringing the economy closer and closer to full employment, and this happens automatically. But this did not happen during the Great Depression. The Great Depression, as you know, lasted from 1929 all the way to the Second World War, 1941. Right? The persistence of the Depression led Keynes to believe that perhaps this wasn't true, that the wage rate wasn't going to fall, that the wage was, in fact, sticky. You see, so the stickiness of wages is what Keynes invoked to explain why the Great Depression wasn't just going away, why it lasted such a long time. Right? So this is a building block of the Keynesian model. There are sticky wages. The aggregate supply curve is not going to shift to the right on its own, bringing the economy back to full employment on its own. You follow me? So this is not going to happen. Let me raise these lines. So how do we bring the economy back to full employment? How do we lower the unemployment rate from, let's say, 10% down to the old 4%? Well, if the AS curve is not going to move to the right on its own, then what needs to be done is that the AD curve needs to be shifted to the right deliberately. You see, if the AD curve was shifted to the right, well, this too would bring the economy closer and closer to full employment, back towards full employment. Right? So the Keynesians believe then that that aggregate demand has to be, in a sense, managed. Right? Aggregate demand has to be actively managed. Now you might say, well, what is the role of the government in this? How can the government actively manage aggregate demand? Well, you must remember that one of the components of aggregate demand is government spending. And that is in the control of the government. That's part of the government's deliberate fiscal policy, as we just learned. Right? So what the government could do in times of recession is increase its spending, government spending. Right? It's not surprising that the Great Depression ended when the US entered the war, Second World War. How's that? Because once the US entered the war, the government began to spend huge amounts of money on armaments, and this gave a big boost to industry, to manufacturing in the US. Correct? So a big increase in government spending might work, and of course the other aspect of fiscal policy is taxes. The government could also lower taxes. Now what would that do, lower taxes? Well, we've just learned that lower taxes would leave households with more disposable income. So consumption spending would then rise, and that too would cause the AD curve to shift to the right. Also, if these taxes were business taxes, a lowering of business taxes would cause firms' investment spending to increase. Firms would be left with more of their sales revenues with which to buy new machines. Right? So this really is the crux of the Keynesian philosophy, right? The building blocks of the Keynesian model, that everything depends on AD, and when there is a recession, aggregate demand has to be actively managed by the government, right? So the government is one party here. I should also mention that there is a very important role here for the Federal Reserve Bank. Right? So what about the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Fed? What these guys do is control the interest rate. Now, you may have heard that because of this coronavirus-induced recession they're going through, the Fed immediately lowered the interest rate down to 0. Now, how would that help? Now, we've just learned that when credit is cheaper, consumption spending and investment spending go up. Correct? So that's the role of the Fed in this. So the government plays a role and the Fed plays a role. The government's policy is fiscal policy. The Fed's policy is called monetary policy. Right? So here is one building block of the Keynesian model. I will briefly now talk about sticky prices. Now, Keynesians have the following view of the aggregate supply curve. Right? So, strictly speaking, the aggregate supply curve, according to Keynesians, is not positively sloped as I have drawn it. Rather, the Keynesian aggregate supply curve looks like this. Real GDP, price level, and it is a horizontal line like this. Horizontal until full employment is reached, and then it becomes vertical. So this is Y sub F. So this is the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. So what is the significance of sticky prices? Now you notice here that if aggregate demand were to decrease, if aggregate demand were to go down from AD1 to AD2, a leftward shift like this, well, we can see here that the price level, the equilibrium price level, remains unchanged. Now, contrast this with a negatively sloped AD curve. Had the AD curve been negatively sloped, I'm sorry, if the had the aggregate supply curve been positively sloped, not horizontal, but positively sloped. So if that had been the AS curve, right, then a leftward shift of AD would have caused the price level to fall. Correct? Keynesians believe that the price level is sticky, that prices are sticky. And this essentially causes the price level to remain unchanged as demand of the economy drops off, decreases. Right? So why are prices sticky? Well, the Keynesians come up with the following explanation. It's called menu costs. So why is this true? And the Keynesians invoke something called menu costs. Now, menu costs are essentially the cost to firms of changing their prices. Now think about, say, Walmart. If Walmart wants to lower prices on all goods, wouldn't it have to, in the middle of the night, send an army of workers with those sticker, those machines that put on new price tags on things, or price stickers on things? Right? They'd have to go through every item and add this price sticker, and that's going to cost a lot in terms of paying these workers overtime, etc. That's one example of a high menu cost. Now, the reason it's called menu costs is, the analogy here is with a fine restaurant, right? In a fine restaurant, you have a nicely printed menu. Now, if the restaurant wants to change prices, it has to order whole new menus, and this is expensive, right? So the point is that if menu costs are high, firms are reluctant to lower price as customer demand decreases. Now, ordinarily, when customer demand decreases, firms have an incentive to quickly lower price so as to keep the customers coming. But with high menu costs, this becomes expensive, hence difficult for the firm to do. Prices, in other words, don't fall rapidly or don't fall at all. Correct? And in the Keynesian story, now that explains this horizontal stretch of the AS curve. Right? Falling demand from AD1 to AD2, but the price level P star remains unchanged. Sticky prices. Right? So this ends my discussion of the building blocks of the ADAS model, ends part 1 of my lecture.